We are here with Dr. Leah Roberts, and I'm so glad she was able to record this session so that you guys can watch it later. So I'm going to give a brief introduction on Dr. Roberts, and then she'll start her talk. So Dr. Roberts is a physician educator dedicated to teaching patients, other medical providers, and community members about medical cannabis. She is the former medical director of the medical cannabis program for the New Mexico Department of Health. She is also a board-certified emergency medicine physician who received her medical degree from West Virginia University and completed residency at East Carolina University's Vidant Medical Center. She also has completed coursework developed by the Portland, Oregon-based Sativa Science Club. I hope I said that right. She speaks on medical cannabis for conferences hosted by Cancer Services of New Mexico and the University of New Mexico, among others. So thank you again, Dr. Roberts, and go ahead and start your talk.
All right, thanks, Shanna. Give me just a second to share my screen here. So today I want to talk a little bit about New Mexico's medical cannabis program, and the title of this presentation is called Compassionate Use and You, which is really based on the name of the law that created New Mexico's medical cannabis program. So a couple of housekeeping items. Some of these don't really apply in the recorded realm, but I don't have any financial disclosures. One of the things that I'd like to talk about sort of at the beginning of the presentation is really the history of the cannabis plant. And that's because it has a long history walking alongside humankind, being used as medicine in different traditions for a really long time. The plant itself emerged from Central Asia about 12,000 years ago in and around the Himalayan mountains. And so we have lots of evidence of different ancient cultures and medical traditions utilizing this plant. Ancient Chinese medicine, Japanese medicine, the ancient Egyptians, Greeks, the Ayurvedic tradition, lots of folk medicine traditions, and Native American or indigenous populations in North America also utilizing cannabis for many of the same medical reasons that we utilize it today. So there really is this long track history of humans utilizing this plant to be able to help themselves medically. And then when we sort of fast forward to what happened in the United States, why is it federally illegal? Well, there is a longstanding history of prohibition that's important to understand. But it really pales in comparison to the 12,000 years of history that we have with the plant. We're talking about 80, 90 years of prohibition. And so really, you'll hear me using the term cannabis over and over again rather than the term marijuana, because marijuana was really a slang term that was popularized through xenophobia over Mexican immigrants coming to the United States after the Mexican Revolution and the Mexican-American War. And so people started to get threatened that this plant, marijuana, was being used in the United States, and they started sort of spreading rumors to fuel prohibition, rumors about drug overdose and addiction. And this was used to, by the early 30s, make about 29 states or so pass their own individual laws against cannabis. And this sort of also coincided with the end of alcohol prohibition. And so the gentleman who was the head of the Alcohol Prohibition Bureau was a guy named Harry Anslinger. And he then became the head of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics. And he made his mission to formally prohibit cannabis use in the United States. Up until this time, pharmaceutical companies like Eli Lilly were making cannabis preparations, which is the bottle that you see on the slide here. So we had lots of pharmaceutical companies making cannabis preparations. At the same time, xenophobia and racism was coming into the conversation surrounding cannabis. And so you see prohibition evolving. There were also men like Mellon and Hearst and DuPont who had interest in nylon and wood that wanted to see hemp outlawed. So there was really this intersection of sort of political and economic reasons for prohibition to occur, even though physicians and pharmacists were utilizing cannabis as a medicine for patients quite effectively. So what happened was the Marijuana Tax Act was passed after lobbying by Harry Anslinger in 1937. And it was essentially an occupational excise tax on both doctors and pharmacists, where they had to have a stamp to be able to prescribe cannabis or have cannabis in their facility. And nobody could afford the stamp. It was cost prohibitive. So it essentially allowed for the prohibition of cannabis. At the time, the American Medical Association opposed the Marijuana Tax Stamp Act, but it still went through anyway. And so in the early 40s, cannabis was removed from the US Pharmacopoeia. And then fast forward another couple of decades, and the Controlled Substances Act of 1970 was passed. And with this, cannabis was labeled a Schedule I substance, meaning that it has no medicinal use. Now, we know that's not true historically, but in any case, politically, that's how this plant and this medicine got labeled. So what's the big picture currently? The big picture is that this is still federally illegal. Now, in the recent election, as well as recent state legislature sessions, we had a massive green wave come through where a number of states, 18 now total, including the District of Columbia, have legalized cannabis for adult use. So New Mexico was amongst those that most recently legalized cannabis for adult use. That's not in place yet. It's been signed into law, but the systems that will regulate it aren't in place yet. But still, 18 states and District of Columbia where any adult can purchase cannabis in a dispensary. Now, 36 states, plus the District of Columbia, Guam, Puerto Rico, and the US Virgin Islands have medical cannabis programs. So as you can tell, really, in terms of the United States and its territories, there is quite a lot of support for medical cannabis programs and also for adult use. Now, the fact that this is federally illegal means that there's really a patchwork of regulation. And that also means there's inconsistency between product. So you have regulations that are different from state to state, meaning what the plant can be grown with, what you can spray on it, what the labeling requirements are. And also it means that federal agencies like OSHA and the Environmental Protection Agency aren't weighing in on this industry at a federal level because it's illegal. So you don't have the Environmental Protection Agency speaking to heavy metal standards or pesticide standards. That varies from state to state. And it also means that products that you get in California could be labeled differently than products that you get in New York, for example, when they get their program up and running. So you've got to be really savvy from place to place in knowing what sort of the differences are between products and between regulations as they impact you as a consumer, both in terms of what your legal rights are when utilizing cannabis and also in terms of what you're buying in the dispensary. So it's really important to be aware that it's very different from place to place. And so don't assume that what you're doing in one state or what you know about one state applies to all of them. Now, the other portion of that is that it means that research about cannabis and its medical uses or its pitfalls or things that might be helpful about it really is rather limited in the United States. And that's because you really have to have a lot of approval through the Drug Enforcement Agency on a federal level just to be able to study it. And those levels of approval are so prohibitive that not very many academic institutions obtain that level of approval. So most of the research is coming from places outside the United States, like Israel, where there is a very comprehensive federal medical cannabis program with a lot of data. And there are not quite the same number of barriers to research. Spain and Portugal are other areas where there's quite a bit of research in cannabis going on. And what that means is that, some of your physicians in the United States might not be comfortable with research that's coming from other countries. So it's important to know that. I would argue that there is a lot of value to the research coming from places like Spain and Israel, but just be aware of that as you're thinking about cannabis and research related to it. So what about New Mexico? Well, New Mexico actually has a very interesting history with medical cannabis. And that is really that we were the first state to pass a law related to medical cannabis back in 1978. And that was the Controlled Substances Therapeutic Research Act. And this allowed for the University of New Mexico to utilize medical cannabis to aid in the treatment of cancer patients. Now, this program lost funding in the mid 80s or so, and so it kind of went by the wayside, but still, we were sort of trailblazers in that area in the late 70s. Now, the gentleman who lobbied for the passage of the Controlled Substances Therapeutic Act is a gentleman named Lynn Pearson, and he was suffering with testicular cancer in the late 70s. He did pass away, but later on lended his name to the law that would ultimately create the medical cannabis program in New Mexico. And that was passed in 2007, and it's called the Lynn and Erin Compassionate Use Act. The Erin of Lynn and Erin is Erin Armstrong, daughter of one of our state legislators, Debbie Armstrong, who's been very active and a champion for cannabis legislation in our state, up to and including the recent adult use legislation that was passed. So what this did in 2007 was establish New Mexico's medical cannabis program to be administered through the Department of Health. We were the 12th state to have a medical cannabis program, and this was passed by legislative measure, not by ballot measure, which was different than many other bits of cannabis legislation, either adult use or medical. Then it took about 3 years or so for the rules and regulations to really be written and promulgated. So that was in 2010. And then in 2012, the Medical Cannabis Fund was passed. And what that meant was that there was a fee that will be taken from producers for every plant that they grow that funds the medical cannabis program. So there are no general fund dollars, no tax dollars that go to fund that program. It is funded solely by fees taken from producers. And then in 2016, the Licensing and Compliance Division of the Medical Cannabis Program was formed. And this is a division of the Medical Cannabis Program within the Department of Health that allows for licensing and compliance officers to visit grow sites and dispensaries and make sure that things are up to regulation and up to code. But as you can tell, that really wasn't that long ago. So there's really only been 5 years or so that these officers of the Department of Health have been entering dispensary spaces and grow spaces to make sure that regulations are being adhered to. And then in 2019, Senate Bill 406 was signed into law by our current governor. And that was the largest change to the Lynn and Erin Compassionate Use Act that we'd seen so far. And that allowed for enrollment to go from 1 year to 3 years. It provided protections for people on parole. It provided protections for parents as it relates to Children, Youth, and Family Division investigations, a number of other things. It was really the largest change to the Lynn and Erin Compassionate Use Act we had seen. But now we have even more nuance to the cannabis industry in New Mexico. And so that is that the bill that was passed in special session recently was signed into law by our governor on April 12th of 2021. So just a week or so ago. A couple of things that this does, in addition to having a really aggressive timeline to bring legal cannabis to New Mexico, is that it does preserve the patient registry portion of the medical cannabis program. So if you're a medical cannabis program patient through the Department of Health, that is going to continue to be maintained in that same way. Now, the licensing and compliance division will change hands. That's going to go to regulation and licensing division. So those will be the folks checking in on the dispensaries, making sure that things are up to code in the grow spaces. But you will still get your medical cannabis card through the Department of Health. And one of the reasons that this is important is that cannabis products are going to be tax exempt for registered medical cannabis patients. So again, if you have your card through the Department of Health, you'll be able to purchase products tax-free as opposed to the tax that will be charged for adult use buyers. So, if you have an indication to remain or to sign up as a medical cannabis program patient, it's going to behoove you in that sort of tax arena. Now, there is a really ambitious timeline for this, in my opinion. Legal sales are to begin no later than April 1st, 2022. So in less than a year, we are supposed to have all of the rules and regulations and staff in place to be able to run a legal adult use program in New Mexico. So it's a tall bill or a tall order for this bill. But it looks like that is the direction that we are headed in now that it's signed into law. So I hope everybody's clear on that. The big pearl here is that if you're a medical cannabis program patient, you will not pay tax. Now, when we go back to looking at the law that established the medical cannabis program, again, it's called the Lynn and Erin Compassionate Use Act. And what it does is allow for cannabis, the use of medical cannabis, to alleviate symptoms related to approved conditions and their treatments. So it's important to understand that this is about compassionate use and it's not about cure. So we're not saying there's some certain amount of cannabis you can take to cure your cancer. And anybody who tells you that is playing fast and loose. So I want you all to be careful about acknowledging that this is not about cannabis to cure a medical condition. This is about cannabis to help alleviate symptoms. And again, this is a system that's regulated through the Department of Health, and even after passage of the adult use law is going to continue to be patient cards run through the Department of Health. So if you have a card currently, you're in good company. There's quite a number of New Mexicans who are enrolled in the program. So as of the end of March 2021, there were over 112,000 patients in a state that has about 2 million people. So that's quite a big percentage. There are a little over 7,400 people that have personal production licenses. And so those are licenses also given through the Department of Health to patients that are already qualified to be in the program so that they can grow their own plants at home. And if you're interested in this, again, you have to be a patient already, but you can apply for a personal production license to be able to grow your own cannabis at home. Now, at present, there are 28 qualifying conditions to be enrolled in the program. The ones that are in the gold color on the slide are the ones that may relate to cancer or its treatments. So obviously cancer is there as an indication itself. Hospice care is there. Nausea and vomiting as it relates to medicines for ongoing cancer treatment is an indication for enrollment in the program. Painful peripheral neuropathy, which a lot of folks experience after chemotherapy, is an indication. Anorexia or cachexia, so total loss of appetite, massive loss of weight, as is often seen with cancer, is an indication for enrollment. And severe chronic pain, which a lot of folks will end up with either related to spread to the bones of their cancer or radiation treatments from their cancer. So the point is that there are a lot of ways for cancer patients to be enrolled in the program, either while they're acutely on cancer treatment or even dealing with the symptoms after a cancer that they've recovered from. The top 3 enrolling conditions in New Mexico remain cancer, severe chronic pain, and post-traumatic stress disorder. So those are the 3 highest enrolling conditions, but there are lots of ways for patients who are currently battling cancer or have battled cancer to get enrolled in the program. Now, some things to know and consider before you think about applying to the program. One is that you have to have a current New Mexico ID or a driver's license. And with COVID and changes with the MVD schedule and things like that, it requires a little bit of extra thought down the road to make sure that your license is current. If it's about to expire, that you have an appointment to get it renewed, or that you've gone online and paid for a renewal license. But just make sure you have that, because they will reject your application if you don't have a current New Mexico ID or driver's license. The other thing is that you need to have a medical provider, and this could be a nurse practitioner, a DO, an MD, anyone with the ability to prescribe medications who supports your enrollment and is willing to sign off on your application. So when I was the medical director with the medical cannabis program, I would have situations where somebody would say, I support this patient being enrolled, but I don't want to sign the paper. Well, if you don't have a medical provider who's willing to sign and put their license down and provide you with a medical record that supports your enrollment, then you have to find somebody who will in order to be enrolled. The other thing to know is that enrollment is free. It does not cost you anything at all to apply for a medical cannabis card through the Department of Health. And that's an important thing. Lots of states charge different fees. New Mexico does not, and it's an important distinction. The other thing to know is that the staff at the Department of Health work very, very hard. They're sort of chronically understaffed, and it does take time for them to process your card as well as a renewal. So try to plan ahead and make sure that they have time to do their piece of the work. You do your piece first, they get it in, if they get it all together, they're able to process that application pretty quickly. If it's split up into different pieces of paper being mailed at different times, there is certainly potential for things to get lost. Back when I was at the Department of Health and we had about 80,000 patients or so, there were days that we would get 800 or 900 pieces of mail. And as you can imagine, with paper filing systems and things, it's hard to reunite those scattered pieces of paper with one application. So make sure you're really sending everything all together. That will help the process flow smoothly for you. So let's go over the components of a complete application now that I've kind of harped on the fact that it's processed most quickly when it's complete. And so that is, there's a portion of the form that's available on the Department of Health's website that has contact information for the patient. And that's because they need to be able to mail you your card. So they have to know what address to get it to you and, what your date of birth is, what your full name is, things like that. There's a portion on the form for the medical provider who's supporting your application to fill out where they provide their contact information in case the Department of Health has a question. And also they provide their license information. The Department of Health does ask for a medical record to be attached to the application. Doesn't need to be years and years of medical records or stacks of paper, but an office visit that shows that you do have cancer or you do have chronic pain helps to support the application so that they know that you're a valid enrolling patient. And then also a copy of that current New Mexico ID or driver's license has to be attached. Make sure it's as legible as possible. If it's a really dark copy and they can't see your face or they can't read the writing or there's a smudge over the date of birth, they could send it back to you and say that it's incomplete. So make sure it's as clear of a copy as possible. And then also, this is really, really important, and that's why it's in a gold color there, and that is that it has to be original signatures on the paperwork, both from the patient and the medical provider. So if your doctor's office wants to keep a copy of it after they fill it out, that's fine, but you have to take the original because the original is what has to be mailed into the Department of Health. They will not accept photocopies over concern for fraud. Now, the medical cannabis program does have a caregiver application, and a caregiver is any adult that a patient agrees can be their caregiver, who is going to have the authority to go to a dispensary and purchase medical cannabis products on the patient's behalf. But this is a separate application because they get their own card. They have to show that card at the dispensary, and they also could potentially have to show that card to law enforcement if they were to be pulled over with, medical cannabis products that they're transporting to your home. So it is a separate application process, and it does have legal benefits for the caregiver who has applied. So that application has contact information for both the patient and the caregiver for the same reasons. They need to be able to reach you by mail and they need to know what your date of birth is. It also has some information from the medical provider who's basically making a statement that, yes, there's a medical need for a caregiver. It can't be sort of reasons like my car doesn't work very often, so I need somebody to go to the store for me. It has to be a medical reason. So maybe, the patient uses a cane and doesn't get around very well. So they need somebody with more mobility to be able to go to the store for them. That would be a medical reason. Or someone's on hospice and can't leave their home, so they need somebody to go to the store for them. So the medical provider is going to sign off on that as well. You need copies of the caregiver's New Mexico ID and driver's license. So that's very important. Not the patient's. They already have that on file with the patient application, but they need the caregiver's New Mexico ID. And then a national background check for the caregiver. There are a couple of narcotics offenses like trafficking and things within the last 3 years that would disqualify a caregiver application. So they do need a national background check. And that's really also to help protect the patient so that we know nobody's being preyed upon by a caregiver. And then also original signatures on this application as well. So there will need to be original signatures from the patient, from the caregiver, and from the medical provider. So again, no photocopies, very, very important. So just a quick summary of do's and don'ts about this application process. So be sure to mail in everything together. If you separate it into, oh, here's a copy of my driver's license and oh, here's the medical record and they're all in different envelopes, chances are that's going to cause you a significant delay. So mail everything in together. do keep a photocopy for your records. It's good for you to have that so that if you ever need to reference it, you've got it on file. Also, I would recommend, if possible, to send it by certified mail. That ensures that you get a stamp in the Department of Health mailroom that says they've received it. That's better than priority mail or overnight mail, that kind of thing. The certified mail actually has to be stamped received by the Department of Health mailroom. And to review the don'ts, again, do not send photocopies. It has to be original signatures, and do not send it until it's complete. Now, like I said, keep in mind, they need about 30 days or so for processing. They do everything they can to try to get it to you sooner than that, but allow 30 days for processing and then a couple days for the post office to deliver your card after that. Now, the post office itself has had significant delays and issues in the past 6 or 8 months. So, it may be more than a few days before the post office gets it to you. It's really out of the Department of Health's hands after it's in the mail. And it's, the job of the post office at that point to get it to you. Now, people ask, once I have my medical card, how do I stay enrolled? What do I do? If I'm a patient or a caregiver, what do I do? Well, you still have to see your medical provider yearly and then mail in the completed form. Your card is only going to expire every 3 years, but you still need to once a year have your doctor or nurse practitioner sign off on that form saying, yes, there's still a reason that they need to be enrolled, and you mail that into the Department of Health. And then if it's the 3rd year, you'll get a new card. So I would recommend setting a reminder in your calendar system, whether you use a computer calendar system or calendar on your phone, a month before you're going to expire, make sure that you're reminding yourself to go ahead and get your paperwork done, or better yet, even 60 days before you're going to expire. So you have time to make that doctor appointment and get in there and get the form signed. Now, if you lose your medical cannabis card or your caregiver card, you can request a free replacement card, and there are forms on the medical cannabis website. So it is free to get that replacement card. Now, if it's a personal production license card, there is a fee for that. But if it's a patient or caregiver card, a replacement card is free. Now, a couple of updates as it relates to COVID-19. Most of our government offices are still shut down and people are working remotely, and the medical cannabis office is no different. So the Santa Fe office that handles all the patient registry issues is not open to the public, but you can still call in and get some help from an individual that's working. There is no set date at this point for reopening to the public, so I don't have any guidance to give you there on when you might be able to go in person. They do have a drop box in the lobby of the office, the Santa Fe office, and that address is on their website. So you can drop off paper applications there. You want to make sure it's in a secure envelope so that nobody can see your information, but get it all together in an envelope and you can put it in a Dropbox if you happen to be in Santa Fe. And then the other thing to know is that if for some reason we were to go into another sort of lockdown situation, the dispensaries are considered essential businesses, just like pharmacies. And so they stayed open throughout the shutdowns earlier. So that ostensibly that would happen again. Now, again, the New Mexico Department of Health does have a phone number that you can call and reach a human being, and then also a website where all of the forms that you would need to renew your patient application, to enroll as a patient, to get your personal production license, to be a caregiver, or to get a replacement card, all of those are available at the New Mexico Department of Health Medical Cannabis Program website. And if you need to speak to an individual, you can call 505-827-2321. And that's Monday through Friday, 8 to 5, barring federal and state holidays. So lots of ways to get information that you need there. And I would recommend, trying to get in touch with somebody if you have a question about the program. Okay, so say you've gone through that whole process, you've got your medical card. Well, now what? Okay, this is what I'm going to say first, is that education is key. So when you get your medical card, there will be a packet of information that comes with it. And I would encourage you to read all of that information that the Department of Health is giving you. They're going to give you a list of dispensaries that's updated every month. They're going to give you a little pamphlet that has some bullet points about what you can and can't do as a patient. So it's really important not to throw that extra paper away and just get excited about the card. Make sure you look at everything that comes in that envelope. And then the next thing I would say is that it's really important for you to do your own research about medical cannabis and do that from trusted sources. So just like folks who work in a dispensary are there to sell you a product. And you would not go to a car dealership and ask the salesman to give you all of the best objective information about the car you want to buy. You would do your own research ahead of time. You would look at some, consumer report ratings. You would talk to your friends or family about the experience they'd had with that type of car. You might go up to somebody you saw with that type of car and ask them if they like driving it. You would test drive it, things like that. So you're going to do your own research about something that you're purchasing from a salesperson. And same thing with cannabis. So, there are a lot of different qualities of education of the folks who work in dispensaries. And I would encourage you to do your own research for that reason. You can learn about things like terpenes and cannabinoids so that you understand more about what the whole plant can do for you medicinally. There is something called the entourage effect, which is where all the different components of the whole plant itself have their own medicinal roles, and they work together to give you the full effect. So these are things you're going to want to learn about online, talking to friends and family, talking to your medical providers before you go into a retail or sales space. You can also learn about the types of products and ways to use them. That can be very helpful because sometimes you get into a sales space or a retail space and there's so many products, so many things to look at. They want to move people through very quickly, and it can be very overwhelming. So if you have an idea of what you're looking for, what you might want to purchase before you go in, a lot of times that can help steer the conversation in a way that's going to benefit you ultimately. So there are a lot of resources online. One is a physician in Maine, Dr. Dustin Sulak, Sulak, who has a website called healer.com, healer.com. And he has a number of different resources for patients that are free. He's a wonderful integrative medicine physician who speaks nationally about cannabis, is on the board of the Society of Cannabis Clinicians. He's a wonderful guy and has lots of great information out there for you. So again, this is a physician that you can get information directly from by spending some time on his website. So you're also going to want to research dispensaries that you may want to use, ask friends or family, ask your medical providers about whether they have any recommendations. A lot of them have, for lack of a better word, menus online of products that they have in stock. And so you can look ahead and try to, kind of get an idea of what you want to do when you go in there, rather than sort of being just deer in the headlights the minute you walk in, because it can be really, really overwhelming in those spaces. And like I said, you're going to want to talk to friends and family. And then when you're talking to your medical team, make sure you're sharing your experiences. Many medical providers weren't educated on cannabis at all. When I was in medical school, almost 20 years ago now, there was no discussion about cannabis. There was no lecture about cannabis. There was no discussion of the pharmacology of cannabis or the endocannabinoid system, which is a system that all of us have inside of us that makes cannabinoids in our bodies and processes cannabinoids that we take in through different products. So those were things that weren't being talked about in medical school. And I can almost guarantee you that every discussion you have with your medical team about cannabis and your experience with it helps to grow their knowledge base, even if it's an anecdotal sort of thing. So in terms of the law, there are some limits on how much medical cannabis you can buy. And it's a little bit difficult to understand. So I try to break it down here, but there may be some questions about it. Please let me know if it's not clear. So the regulations call for something that is termed adequate supply. And an adequate supply is called 230 units over a 90-day period. And this is a rolling period, meaning that if you purchase 5 units today, 90 days from now, 5 more units will become available to you. So it's not that on the 90th day, you have some deposit in your unit account. It just rolls over. And that's meant to kind of make sure that everybody has a supply available to them throughout that 90-day period. So there's a conversion factor for units, and it'll be listed on your product when you buy it at the dispensary. But 1 unit is equal to 1 gram of dried cannabis flower or 1 unit is equal to a derived product like edibles or an oil-based tincture that is 200 milligrams of THC would equal 1 unit. And you can go in and purchase any combination of things if you have enough units. So you could purchase 4 grams of dried flour and a package of cookies and a package of lozenges. As long as you have that number of units in your account, you can purchase all those things in one day. You don't have to make separate purchases or go back day to day to day, as long as you have the units. Now, the units are tracked by a statewide software. And so anyone at the Department of Health, if you call up or in the dispensary, can tell you how many you have left. You're probably it's going to be a more efficient use of your time to ask someone at the dispensary how many units you have left in your account, because it can be a little bit overwhelming to try to get staff on the phone through the phone tree at the Department of Health. So I would ask at the dispensary if you're not sure. But technically, the Department of Health could tell you how many units you have as well. And now there is a rare occasion where people do run out of units over a 90-day course. And if that's consistently happening, your medical provider can write a letter requesting a medical exception to the medical director with the medical cannabis program. And if they agree, then they can increase your limit up to 345 units over 90 days. And that limit was written into the regulations. It's not just a number they come up with, it was written into the regulations. So again, if you're running up against that limit, you can have your medical provider write the medical director at the Department of Health and try to get that limit increased. Now, there are a lot of questions about how much it costs. I mean, it's not covered by insurance. And so for a lot of folks, the cost of medical cannabis can be really difficult to cover. Now, there's one caveat to that, and that is if your qualifying condition is related to an approved workers' compensation claim, then workers' compensation will reimburse people for medical cannabis. So say you had severe chronic pain related to an on-the-job major back injury, they may cover medical cannabis in that instance. But otherwise, it's really coming out of your pocket. So this is why it's important to discuss what the cost is. And so the Department of Health every quarter releases reports that it comes from data that's given by all the producers. So the average number of units purchased per patient was 70 units in the fourth quarter. And what that tells us is people still have a lot of units left that they could purchase, right? We just talked about on that last slide that people have up to 230 units that they're able to purchase over a 90-day period. So that's essentially a quarter of the year. So we don't appear to have an issue with supply. That doesn't mean you're going to be able to find the same product that you want every single time you go back, but it does mean that other products should be available to you. And the average price of 1 gram of flour, again, coming from that fourth quarter producer report, is $9.25 a gram. So that's, can be quite expensive for folks. There are some community organizations, I believe, that are giving some grants. And so you can check with the Cannabis Chamber of Commerce in Albuquerque and see if they know of any patient assistance programs. Lots of dispensaries have discounts for veterans or specials on certain days of the week. So if you have a certain producer or dispensary that you like, you can talk to them about any discount programs they might have for certain groups of patients. But otherwise, it can get pretty spendy. Now, this is my caution slide that has the stick figure falling down, because it's very important to understand that cannabis is now grown to be very, very potent. And so you should not assume anything based on your prior experience. If you smoked cannabis with your roommate in college in the 70s, or your cousin in the 80s, or your, somebody else in the 90s, this is not the same thing today. It's grown to be, in some cases, 5 and 6 times more potent than cannabis was in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. So it's very, very important to know that this is a whole new animal these days. And for that reason, you really have to know how to read labels carefully. This goes back to the education part, where you've done your research ahead of time. You know what THC is, and THC is the part that's going to make you feel high. CBD is the part that's not going to make you feel high. And then there are a bunch of other cannabinoids. So you know all these things, and you're looking at a label and you're reading it very carefully to make sure that you're getting a product that you want. This is one of the reasons that you can use products that have different ratios of THC and CBD to really modify the feeling of being high. You can use something that's 1 part THC to 1 part CBD, and that's going to be way more mellow than something that's just pure THC. Likewise, if you've got something that's 5 part CBD to 1 part THC, you might not even really feel much in terms of feeling high or altered. You might just get mostly the benefit of the CBD. So all of that is going to be on the label, and it's really important for you to know what you're looking at and to know what you're looking for. And that's where the education comes in. So you can certainly ask questions at the dispensary. Please do. Again, remember that those folks are there to sell you a product, and that there's vastly different qualities of education amongst people working at dispensaries. And that's not to demean anybody, but it's just to say that there is not a standardized education system in place at this point, and really their goal is to sell you a product. So final parting words here in all caps, because it's so important. You start low and go slow. And this is a mantra we use for several things in medicine that speaks to the fact that if you give somebody too much of something, you can't take it back. If you give just a little bit, you have room to go up until you get a good effect for the patient. So the same thing, when you're managing your own medical cannabis, you want to start at a very low dose and slowly increase, because if you go overboard to begin with, you're going to have a bad experience, and that might turn you off from future benefits that you could see if you just kind of started out low and worked up from there. So, like we were talking about with the education portion and knowing what you're reading, there is some standardization surrounding labeling in New Mexico. And so just like when you go to the store, you can look at the sodium content of something, you can look at the carbohydrate content of something and the protein, and you're wanting to do that to manage your diabetes or your high blood pressure. You're going to also want to look very carefully at labels on cannabis products. And there were new requirements that went into effect in the fall of last year. So there is a standardized label on all cannabis products, meaning that if you go to a dispensary in Las Cruces and you go to a dispensary in Santa Fe, even if they're owned by different people, they are going to have the same kind of label. So your eyes will learn where to go for how much THC is in there, how much CBD is in there, and over time you become familiar with it. Now, the THC and CBD content is reported both in milligrams and in percentages. So you want to be clear on what you're looking at when you're reading that label. It also will say how many units are going to be deducted from your account if you purchase that product. So again, that goes back to the concept of adequate supply that's attached to your medical cannabis patient benefit. So if you only have 2 units left and you're looking at a package that says 3 units, if you take that, to be rung up, they won't be able to let you leave the store with it because you don't have the units necessary. So that will be on the label as well. And then some instructions for use as well. Now, additionally, there is a requirement in the regulations that a drug information sheet be available upon request. And so this is going to be especially important for people with, say, a nut allergy or a gluten intolerance. You can ask for this drug information sheet in the dispensary, and it will tell you whether that cookie, for example, was packaged in a facility that also processes nuts. If you have a severe peanut allergy, you can't risk that. So those are going to be important things that you can ask for upon request. They're not required to give it to you every single time, but you can ask for it, and I would ask for it. Also, likewise, if you have diabetes or other special dietary requirements, you're going to want to know, how much sugar is in there, or other things that might be important to you based on, whether you're a vegetarian or you're vegan or that sort of thing. So that is available to you, and again, required by regulation. So you can ask for it and they should be able to produce it. Now, this is a really quick and dirty slide about ways to use cannabis. And really, people are developing new ways all the time, but some of the sort of big ways are ones that everybody knows. So inhalation. This works very, very quickly because as you inhale it through your lungs, it's carried pretty much directly to the brain. And so you'll have an onset of feeling what you're going to feel from using that product within 60 to 90 seconds, very, very fast. So this is methods like smoking out of a pipe or out of papers or vaporizing. And then the other method that folks think about quite a bit is taking something by mouth. So this is a cookie or a lozenge or an oil-based tincture. This is when you take something and swallow it rather than holding it underneath your tongue. There's a different word for that, and we're going to get to that in just a minute. So it can take hours to see effect when you take something by mouth. And that's because this isn't processed going from your bloodstream straight to your brain. It's processed through your liver, and your liver needs time. And it also depends on what's in your stomach at the time that you take something. So there are a lot of factors that mostly have to do with things going on in your gut that affect how quickly you're going to see effect from something you swallow. So it can be 1 to 2 hours. And this is why if you're taking something by mouth, an edible of some sort, you've got to be very patient and do not repeat the dose. People get into trouble if they're 20 minutes into taking an edible and say, I don't feel anything, so I'm going to take twice as much, or I'm going to take another dose. And then all of a sudden, folks are really feeling paranoid and having a fast heart rate and feeling badly, and they're going to the ER. I was working in the emergency room in Washington when cannabis became legal for adult use there in 2012. And, the number of folks of all ages, teenagers to 80-year-olds that I saw coming in by ambulance because they had taken too much of something by mouth because they didn't wait long enough was very high. So be patient. Do not repeat the dose. You're better off waiting until the next day rather than repeating a dose, especially if you're new to using cannabis. Over time, you'll get a sense for how many milligrams do what for you, and you'll be better off. But early on, please do not repeat the dose. Be very patient. If for some reason you do get into trouble, you've taken too much of something with THC in it, you can use a pure CBD product and kind of try to take that edge off. But again, that's going to take some time to take effect as well. Now, another method is what we were talking about a little earlier, and that's sublingually. And that's where you place something underneath your tongue, and it does absorb quicker than if you just swallowed it. So that would be onset of action in about 30 minutes or so. And some people do utilize layering of these different methods to get the effects that they want. Sort of some cancer patients might vaporize something right before eating so that they have relief of nausea and vomiting right before eating. And then at the same time, while their nausea is controlled, take something that's oral so that it's going to last 8 to 10 hours to help control pain, related to a radiation treatment or something like that. So people do layer these different types of ingestions. And then there are also options for topically applying cannabis products, either in the form of patches, if you can find them, which is fairly rare, or ointments, or people are selling bath soaks and things like that that can still be absorbed through mucous membranes. So there are lots of different ways to add cannabis into your medical routine. Now, folks always want to know, are vaping and vaporization different? Or at least I should say vaping and vaporization are different, whether you wanted to know that or not. So many people may remember the real public health crisis that was going on in the fall of 2019 surrounding vaping and vaping-induced lung injury. And this is why I say, please avoid vaping. And so vaping is what's referring to the use of concentrated cannabis products that's inhaled through one of those vaporized pens or an electronic cigarette. And the reason that this is scary is because there's contamination from additives to the oils to the cartridge components, things like the metal components of the cartridge or the plastic pieces. We don't really know what's leaching into that oil, even if the oil itself is pure and doesn't have any additives. And this has been associated with serious lung injury and has led to many deaths. So the CDC has still not totally been able to pinpoint one causative agent for that vaping crisis. We have some ideas about things we know that are definitely not good, but we still think there are a lot of wild cards in terms of what's in the cartridge components, what other additives could be a part of this, how are things interacting together inside that cartridge. And so really, the better part of valor is just to say, please avoid it. I understand that it's very convenient. Lots of folks find it very portable, very discreet, and I understand that. But in terms of risk and benefit and the trade-offs, I really, really would avoid it. I wouldn't recommend that anybody I love or care for use these vape pens or e-cigarettes. Now, vaporization itself is very different, and that is a process of heating dried cannabis flower, the whole flower itself, to just below its combustion point in a specialized device. And there are lots of different proprietary devices, one called a volcano, there's another one called a PAX, P-A-X, and these are products that take the whole plant, the dried cannabis flower, and heat it to just below combustion, like I was talking about. And so you're going to get the vapor from that, and with it, you're going to get the whole plant medicine. So that whole entourage effect of all the different cannabinoids and all the different terpenes working together to provide you an added medical benefit compared to these products that are just something that was isolated in a lab or extracted with things that you wouldn't otherwise want in your lungs or on your body. So I would, if you're going to go the route of vaporization, I would stick with vaporization rather than vaping. And that's what I have to say on that part. So I thank you all very much for your time. Please note that the slides are streamlined, but this is a really complex subject with a lot of nuance to it. And so really, I don't intend people to just take photos or something of the slides and use those later, because there's a lot of commentary that I'm providing that helps give sort of an additional understanding. So I appreciate your help with that. And then there are some references here available for you that you'll get with the presentation as well, just related to the regulations in New Mexico and some of the reports and Senate bills that I referenced. And then also, please do check out that website for Dr. Dustin Sulak, S-U-L-A-K. His website is healer.com. And I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen now. I appreciate everybody's attention and everybody's interest in this hot topic. Cannabis is not going away. It's only going to get more complex. If the federal landscape ever changes, it's going to be a whole new redo as well. And so I guess the best I can say is stay tuned. Thank you for your interest. I wish everybody well with their ongoing health journey.
And thank you again, Dr. Roberts. And everybody be well.
Thanks, Jen. Take care. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.